Okay, let's see, Mr. Leinbach. So I guess so. Why don't we start with some introductions, Mr. Leinbach? Thank you already. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Dave Haas. I'm treasurer of North Georgia Barbershop Singers, the Lake Lanier chapter. I guess I've been treasurer this time for about 2 years. I was the original treasurer when the chapter was founded, and then I moved away and came back and shortly became treasurer again. I was recently told, and I can't say this for sure, but I was recently told that in the history of the society, there has never been a contested election for treasurer. Um, I'm not I'm not sure if that's true, but in our chapter it certainly is. So good to be here with you guys.
Thank you. Um, Tom Brown. Good morning or good afternoon,
Hello
rather, I
and
should
good
say.
morning from the Birmingham area. I'm uh, treasurer for Central Alabama Voices of the South for this 2021 season. And for 2020, last year, I was a sort of backup guy. When we went into the pandemic mode, I had just set up for our chapter Quicken account and had things kind of going. I do bookkeeping for about four other organizations. And so, it kind of came with the territory, but then we couldn't get together. So I was stuck with it. But I just want to say, I treasure the time.
Pun intended.
Thank you, Tom. Barry Munns. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Um, I'm a member of the Big Chicken. I'm probably the junior member. I've been there only 6 years, going on 7. Um, I'm the treasurer. I haven't been sworn in yet, though, so I'm to be your treasurer this year. Um, I sing lead, and I don't have anything. I don't have any fancy history to tell y'all about. I've just been in 6 years, and I'm trying the best I can. That's it.
All right, thank you, Barry. Corey, say hi to everybody.
Hello, Corey Bethram here. I'm the Dixie District Music City Chorus treasurer. I had the pleasure of being the treasurer after George stepped down, and trying to figure it out still and do the best that I can, and looking forward to learning what else I should be doing in this class.
Way to sell me as a guy who knows how to do transitions. Thank you, Corey. Patrick McAlexander.
Hello, I'm Patrick. I serve as the treasurer for the Middle Tennessee chapter, which is the new noteworthy mixed chorus. I'm also the music and performance VP for Music City, but I feel like I have a better handle on how to do that job than I do on the treasurer job. We don't have a lot of money, but we also don't have a lot of expenses. So I have very little experience to go off of from my noteworthy treasurer time. So I'm just going to try to be a sponge here and learn as much as I can.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So just to give you a little bit of background for me, I have been an accountant for a very long time. I am a CPA, though my license isn't active currently. Excuse me. I work for Broadcast Music Incorporated, the performing rights organization in the accounting and finance department. And my role there is predominantly as a technologist, if you will. I serve as the super user for the Oracle e-business suite applications that we use for all of our financial accounting. I also work with the controller and CFO on questions of accounting policy and practice. So I have a lot of experience with research and writing in the field of accounting theory. So that doesn't necessarily make me the most practical of people, but it does make me pretty comfortable in being able to discuss ideas. And while there is a certain amount of factual information that we need to cover, I also want this discussion to be as driven by your needs and your interests and your particular problems or things that you would like help in trying to improve on in your own experience. So for that end, as we go through the material that I'm going to present to you, which I shared with you the other night, I also want you to feel free to interrupt me, ask questions, especially if you have examples of things that you're struggling with or that you've done that address a specific topic as we're discussing it, and you feel that it will enrich the discussion for the other members, please feel free to share. And with that, I would like to give my successor and my wingman today, Mr. Bob Peters, an opportunity to introduce himself and to give his thoughts on what we're going to cover today, because he is also an experienced district treasurer as well.
Yes, I was treasurer for Voices of the South for a couple years here. I've lost my picture, so I'll just talk. Previously, was treasurer for the Thoroughbred Chorus in Louisville, Kentucky for about 7 years, and moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and took over here. During that 7-year period at Thoroughbreds, I also served as the Cardinal District treasurer for about 2 years during that time, and enjoy the work. It can be sometimes demanding and pressured, but if you just take your time and follow through, things get done. So.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, with that, I'm going to share my screen and I am going to kick things off. I want to share screen too, please. Thank you. Okay, are you seeing my screen? Because right now I can't tell.
Yes.
Okay,
Mhm.
great. Wonderful. So I am going to talk through this, and let me now get the...
I may have to log out and
Just
come
a
back
minute.
in, guys. I've lost this picture.
Oh, have you?
We can see you, Bob.
Okay, well, that's fine then. I just
Okay.
can't see the slides, so.
Yeah, we can see you just fine. If you can't see what we're presenting, then by all means click out and click back in.
Yeah,
You may have to go through Melinda to get brought back into the
Yeah.
meeting.
yeah, let me do that because I've increased the sound on my system, but when I did that, it logged out. So let me do that and I'll get back into you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. We'll see you
Yeah.
again soon. Okay, so I have taken this. This is not the full presentation that's available on the BHS website. I did edit a little bit. I took out the parts that relate to Canada, since none of us are going to have to deal with Canadian regulations. So I think that that was probably not relevant material. We're going to discuss at a high level what the basic responsibilities of a district treasurer or a chapter treasurer are from a corporate perspective, from a business perspective of your chapter, and then what your role should be in chapter board meetings. We'll talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available to you through BHS, and they are fairly extensive, so I encourage you to make use of them. I've also given you the opportunity to use them through some of the things that I provided in the link that I sent you last night, so feel free to use those. We're going to talk about some of the specifics of keeping records, financial records in particular, for your chapter. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some very, very formal regulatory things like insurance and tax compliance. So with that, come on. Okay, so we're going to basically, I already talked through that. So basically, let's talk about what a treasurer is really for. So a treasurer is really the person who is supposed to have custody and responsibility for the chapter's assets and for keeping track of where those assets and how those assets are being used. Now, for most chapters, most of those assets are in the form of money. And very obviously, some chapters will have some other kinds of inventory, like they might have costumes that are considered to be part of the chapter's property. A lot of you will have risers that are considered part of your property. A lot of you may have other things that you use on a regular basis as part of the chapter's activities that you buy and you keep track of. Those are the kinds of things that you want to be aware of uh, when you're dealing with chapter members and your board in particular. We also expect you to be a knowledgeable person when it comes to the status of those assets when people on your board or in your chapter have questions to ask, and they will. And so they are going to be looking to you to be the person who can explain not just where you are, but also to some extent why you are where you are from a financial perspective. And they're going to ask you to do that both at board meetings and outside of board meetings. So at a corporate level, in most states, if you form an organization, you really are required to have 3 officers, and as a matter of course, you need to have a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. And in some places, treasurers and secretaries can be one and the same person. That's also true in BHS's chapter bylaws. Secretaries and treasurers can be the same person. It's not necessarily the best choice, but if you're a little bit short of people to serve in roles, it's also a possible venue for you to explore. When you meet every month as a board, and the chapter standard chapter bylaws do generally tend to require you to meet every month unless you choose a executive committee format. And I don't know if any of the chapters that you're dealing with have chosen that format. We discussed it in Music City a couple of years ago. We never could figure out a practical way to make it happen. That's a form of organization where a smaller group of officers basically run most of the business. And then the full board meets generally on a quarterly basis to ratify those decisions. But most of the time as a board, you're going to meet monthly, and most boards are going to expect you to present a financial report of some sort to basically to help them understand the chapter's financial position, which is usually done in the form of a balance sheet, which will list your assets and your liabilities, and then an income statement, which will list your sources of revenue and your expenses for that period of time. There are lots of different ways to do that. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that are available to do that electronically. And I do recommend that you use electronic tools because I think the days of people being able to keep journal books on paper are long since behind us. And I think that a lot of the tools that are available, in particular, we'll talk about QuickBooks and Quicken along the way, have a very convenient checkbook metaphor, which I think is very understandable for most people. And they also provide a certain amount of reporting support in terms of presenting both income statements and balance sheets that will help to reduce the amount of time you need to use to support those reporting responsibilities. Now, more generally, you're going to need to keep accurate records of where money is coming in and where it's going out. That's why it's important to use a tool, because basically, not only do you want to just keep a track of how much went in and how much went out, you also need to understand where it comes from and what purpose it's used for, because that is how you actually help a board and a chapter understand how the things that it does affect its financial standing. A very important role that you're going to play is that you're going to need to prepare a budget. Now, you're not the only person who has responsibility for preparing budgets for a chapter. This is something that often can seem to fall much more heavily on the shoulders of a treasurer, but it's part of your job to basically make sure that all of the board is engaged in that process, because largely what you're doing is you're helping them to define what their needs for the coming year are going to be. And that's really the important part of your support for a chapter's operations, is to basically to get people to think about, well, I want to accomplish this, and I think it will require this much money or these kinds of resources to make that happen. Those are important questions to ask. A good board, a good president will help a board think through that. But it's also your job to help make sure that they focus to an extent on exactly what the financial implications of those plans are going to be. Some of the things you can predict, some things you can sort of guess at, some things are going to be very uncertain. The fact that they are uncertain doesn't mean that you can sort of throw up your hands and say, I don't know. You have to, in some way, shape, or form, help your board come to a position of here's at least what I think. Budgets are never exact. Budgets are to a certain extent plans, and no plan, as they say in the military, survives contact with the enemy. And in this case, the enemy is just the real world, because the real world will throw things at you that you didn't expect, or that you thought you had a good handle on what something would either bring you or what it would cost you, and you turn out to be wrong. That's okay. Being wrong is not a sin. It's not a crime. It just means that you were wrong. You use it as information to help you perform better the next time you do that same thing. The other things you're going to do for your chapter is you're going to be the person who's got primary responsibility for making sure that its regular bills are paid on time and in full. Now, that may sometimes mean that you need to get on your officers or other people who have positions of responsibility in your chapter, because they may not necessarily immediately give you invoices that they receive for things that they spent money for, or that they've um, obligated your chapter to spend money for. And then also you're going to be compiling financial records that are going to be used to file not only your financial review, as they emphasize here, but you're, even more importantly, you're going to have to file a tax return, and you're going to have to file potentially some Form 1099s for people that you pay to perform services for your chapter. So with the society, you have a couple of responsibilities, and those mostly are related to things that the society provides for chapters as a matter of course, but it doesn't always do them at zero cost. And one of the biggest things is the insurance payments that you make as a chapter to the society. Now, you receive an invoice from the society for that, usually in the first quarter of every year. And the premium is generally based on the number of registered active members you had at the preceding December 31st. This is something that depending on how your chapter operates, if you tend to have a large um, influx of people at the end of a year, may cause surprising cost. I think from the Music City chapter standpoint, one of the things that we have done in the past is that we have had members join us for international competition as add-ons to their regular chapter membership, but then forgotten to take them off the rolls before the end of the year. And that's actually raised our insurance premium for the year. That may not necessarily be a thing that's common to a lot of chapters, but if it's something that you have a chapter that happens to get engaged in, make sure to remind them of that, because it can help to keep their costs down. Because at least one year, it was a relatively unpleasant surprise for the Music City chapter. So it's something to be aware of. You're also going to be asked to participate in the process of copyright compliance. And that mostly comes in the form of um, when you do shows or other events that are paid, that have paid attendance, you have to file clearance reports for BMI, CSAC, and ASCAP that basically have to be filed primarily by your chapter secretary, but they also require a payment. So you will have to coordinate with your chapter secretary to do that. And obviously, one of the things you want to do on a regular basis is part of your financial reporting responsibility is you want to make sure that any bank accounts that you hold on behalf of the chapter, or that you control on behalf of the chapter, are being reconciled on a regular basis. You should be getting hopefully monthly statements from your bank. If you're not, see if what you can do to arrange to get monthly statements from your chapter, from your bank at that point, so that you can get that. You're also going to be participating in copyright compliance. I should mention that making sure that when your chapter is purchasing music and purchasing learning media, that they are doing it from reputable people And most of the people who do this, I think just about everybody that I'm aware of who does this, that is a part of the society, is very much aware of the importance of copyright compliance and does comply, but make sure that your officers are using reputable people to do that, and they are complying with copyright laws themselves. That's an important thing. I happen to work in the copyright field. It's important to me. I think it's important. I think it's something a lot of people don't understand clearly. But I think the society, because we deal with intellectual property all the time, has a particular responsibility to be responsible in how it approaches that topic. And that's enough soapboxing from me on that topic. So at a chapter board meeting, you're obviously a voting member. So you have a direct say in the decisions that are made, but you're also basically there to serve as a resource of information. And that means sometimes you're going to be able to give your chapter board good news. Sometimes you're going to have to give your chapter board bad news. And you need to be able to do both with equal confidence. And you need to be able to do both having done the necessary work to be sure that what you're telling them is accurate and correct. I think that's just an important thing to do. One of the things that I can't stress enough is that there are a couple of things that are regulatory in nature that will differ from state to state depending on where you are. And I think it's important for you, your chapter secretary, and your chapter president to be sure that you understand what those things are and that someone is assigned specific responsibility for doing it. As a case in point, and this is not something that's true in all states, the state of Tennessee has a separate registration for charitable solicitations. So if you intend in any way, shape, or form to make direct appeals to people outside of your organization for money to help support your operations, you have to renew this registration every year. It's not necessarily the treasurer's responsibility to do it, but it is something that can fall through the cracks if somebody in your chapter board has not been assigned specific responsibility for it, so that your chapter president has the opportunity to hold that person accountable. That I know I've heard so far. I think that's not necessarily in Alabama. I don't think that's necessary in Georgia, but I know it is necessary in Tennessee. So it's something to be aware of. Some states require you to renew your corporate eligibility filings every year. Some states do it only every 2 or 3 or 5 years. That's something that you should be aware of as well. And between you, your president, and your secretary, be sure that you know whose responsibility that is and make sure that it gets done. And then obviously you're going to want to talk with your district treasurers when you think that they can help you with questions or information or perhaps techniques. Last year, somebody reached out to me to talk about the possibility of some advice about an investment program because they felt that they had a sufficient cash reserve that they could actually put that money to better use than just leaving it in a typical money market account, which if you're lucky is paying maybe 0.2% per month in interest, which um, isn't very productive use of money. So there are lots of things that you can do if you have the resources to do them with. And that's something that you should talk not only with your district treasurer, but I would encourage you to establish open relationships with other chapter treasurers. I mean, Patrick and Corey, both being members of Music City, have obviously an open conduit to one another. But I would think that you would want to use one another as resources too, and reach out to them when you have a question. Say, hey, I'm doing this. We haven't done it in here before. Do you have experience with this, and talk about that. And by that means you can actually maybe extend your knowledge of how to deal with specific situations you might encounter over the course of your term as treasurer. So let's talk about general control of money. If your boards have not already done so this year, one of the first things that you need to do is make sure that um, in your first board meeting of the new year, make sure that you have specifically designated people within the chapter who are going to be able to use the chapter's bank accounts directly. Now, once upon a time, this usually came in the form of being able to sign a check on behalf of the chapter. More often than not nowadays, that comes in the form of being able to use a check or debit card that is directly tied to the chapter's bank account, particularly its checking account. This will, for just about every bank that I'm aware of, require you to have a signature card on file for that person. In these days of COVID, that is not necessarily always an easy thing to arrange, because you as the primary account holder basically always have to be present to authorize that. Um, Banks, I know Bob Peters and I have been working on this with regard to the district's accounts. And so one of the things that banks have been willing to do for us, particularly because we are geographically separated, is that basically I was able to go into a local bank branch here, get the process started, that Bob can then finish at a branch close to him. And we are fortunate in that the bank that the district uses has branches both here in Nashville and near Birmingham, where Bob resides. So that's something you should think about. You should think about doing. It's not to say that every officer should have the ability to use funds directly from your bank accounts, but there are probably a couple of roles, and I think Patrick can speak to this, where it's useful to be the vice president of music and performance, because one of their roles is going to be in securing music and learning media for their chapter. That's going to be something that it can be inconvenient if they have to reach out to you every time that they need to pay for something. So that's one role where you might. Another role where you might consider making that available is your vice president of marketing and public relations, because they are going to potentially need to buy, they're going to need to buy promotional materials like flyers, or they might have to pay for advertising in a local newspaper, or perhaps local radio or TV stations if you have the budget for that. I know that's something the Music City has done. Um, So basically, if you haven't already done that, make sure that you do that. Make sure that you and your board are clear about who's got that authority, and then take whatever steps are necessary to make sure that that arrangement is set up with your bank appropriately. And if your bank allows you to do it and your board thinks it's prudent, to set dollar limits on the amount of transactions that they can perform on your behalf. I think so long as your board is openly discussing things like purchases of music and learning media on a regular basis, and those officers are clearly describing what the expected cost is, you shouldn't have a problem. I think it's one of those things where you want to be able to control, but you also want to give officers who are after all, officers for a reason. They've been given authority and responsibility to make things happen. And you don't, as treasurer, want to necessarily be a roadblock in keeping those things from happening. So I think you and your board need to find the balance that fits your chapter's needs. I've been talking a lot, and we're coming up in about 15 to 20 minutes from a break. So does anybody have any questions or comments before I go on any further?
Just a further point,
Sure, Tom.
George, that the authorization by the board of signatories and use of debit card needs to be noted in the minutes. And very often there's a resolution that's carried to the bank or filled out at the bank for that.
Yeah, and then it depends on the bank. Some banks have their own form for that.
Right.
Other banks
Yeah.
will simply accept a copy of your meeting minutes with the particular resolution highlighted.
George, I got a question for you. I don't really remember last year exactly what time of each month in the beginning of the year. I remember having to um, refile for various things and pay certain things, like the insurances and things of that nature. Is there a list somewhere where the expected dates are for when that needs to be done?
Um, you should be getting, as chapter treasurer, you should be getting regular emails from Nick Anello. Um,
I don't know. I'd have to
Yeah,
look.
BHS will at least send emails reminding you about insurance
yeah.
specifically.
Okay.
Beyond
I
that,
haven't received any. That's why I was just making sure, because I remember like early on that there was several things that I needed to take care of. Like,
yeah, if I remember right, that came like later in January or maybe in February last year.
yeah, I
Yeah,
just
it's,
remember exactly when it was. I just remember when I came on, there was stuff. There was like 2 or 3 things I needed to take care of right away, and I just want to make sure I don't forget them this year.
yeah, I think the key things that I think we'll get to some of this. I think, and at this point in time, the key things you need to be focusing on right now is that if you are paying anybody as an independent contractor, in particular your directors, you need to be getting ready to send your 1099s out.
Yes, yes,
Okay, that's a number one thing you need to be doing it for January.
yes, yeah. I expected that part. I just couldn't remember about the insurance and the. I know it was like in February or March that I had to renew the thing to allow us for charitable contributions and so forth.
Yeah, that usually comes due actually in the state of Tennessee. Those usually come due in mid-year. But
Okay.
I think one of the things that happened with last year is the fact that the charitable solicitations contribution is it got dropped in
Okay.
2019, and so we kind of had to pick it up as a late thing, and we had to pay a late fee. So I think that's so that was again one of the reasons I talk about that specifically for Tennessee is because it was something that Doug and I and the secretary at the time that we just did not make sure that somebody had specific responsibility for it, and so everybody kind of thought that the other guy was taking care of it, and we let it fall through the cracks.
Yeah, I just think it's going to be important this year, especially if I'm going to continue being the treasurer, to take accurate notes of when expectations are for things, so that we don't have to pay any penalties or anything like that. And I think that might be useful for whoever would hopefully replace me in the future as well.
Yeah, I think from that standpoint, I think that the key things for you to follow up on are the corporate registration for the state of Tennessee for the chapter.
Okay.
Let's see, when does that need to be renewed and how frequently? Because again, Tennessee uses if I remember correctly, they also use a July 1 fiscal year.
Yes.
So that's basically those things are going to roll around at that time generally. So that's why the charitable solicitation thing is renewed by June 30th of every year. And I think the other thing that I think you need to do, and I think this will again vary from chapter to chapter, if you are part of a community that does something like in Tennessee, we call it, good Lord, I'm having a brain freeze. It's the big give or something like that, where you
Yeah.
need to be registered with something like
Yeah, the big payback.
the big payback. Thank you, Patrick. Just having a brain freeze for a minute there. Um, if you participate in something like that, there are going to be places that you need to have your up to date officer lists and budgets and most recent tax returns on file in order to qualify to receive funds through those kinds of giving initiatives. And that's managed through the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. There may be similar foundations in your area. And if you have that kind of big payback type event, I know they happen in a couple of different states in our area, in our region. So I think be aware of those. And if your chapter isn't participating, I would encourage you to find a way to get involved, to get that, because if you actually do focus on promoting that. It can be a useful source of additional funds to support your chapter's operations, particularly the things that represent your outreach to the larger community. Because that's one of the most important things that those organizations are looking to support is outreach. And I think everybody who gets involved in those is looking for arts organizations to support. And if you can make a case for yourself as someone who has community impact, then you can actually get a lot of interest and a fair amount of money, not just from people who are already your friends, but you can find a way to make new friends. And I think that's an important thing for all of us as district and chapter leaders to be engaged with. Um, does anybody have any questions about things like doing? I'm going to assume that most adults pretty much still reconcile their checkbooks every month in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, hopefully everybody does. I know we do, but a question for you on that particular line item on your PowerPoint there, George, is the retained statements and canceled checks or duplicates or check stubs. Now, statements we have,
Right.
we don't have duplicates of checks, and we don't get checks back from the bank anymore, obviously.
Yeah. And
Do we need to be making copies of checks before we issue them?
no, I don't. I don't agree with that. What I do want you to know is that checks, banks have by and large, and I don't know of anybody that does anymore, have stopped returning canceled checks to the people who wrote them. This is because of something that actually dates back to September 2001, an initiative of the Federal Reserve called Check 21, that basically is what permits us all to use checks at Kroger or other places directly. What happens is that those checks get transformed immediately into what are called automated clearinghouse transactions. So they become electronic funds transfers rather than live checks. And that's why most banks will actually send you, if you write checks, you'll get images of those checks that have been negotiated attached to your statements. So that will allow you, if you preserve your statements, to have copies of your checks as well. Number one. And also, I would say, if I haven't mentioned this already, if your bank offers an electronic banking service, I strongly recommend that you take that up and participate in that. Does one things that it cuts down on the amount of money that you have to spend on replacing check stock periodically. Number one. Number two, it actually does help improve the quality of your record keeping. As we talk later on about using electronic tools like Quicken or QuickBooks to help you with your bookkeeping process. And then basically it also allows you to send money without necessarily having to spend money on postage. Because in a lot of cases, if they can't send something directly electronically to a recipient, they will do the mailing for you. So that saves you on postage costs right there. So that's a good note, Tom. Thank you very much for adding that.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'm new at this.
Okay.
This may be in the wrong section. This has to do with income and expense.
Sure thing.
The question is, if an expense is incurred by a member and he chooses not to submit for repayment from the chapter, does that have to be shown as income on one side and expense on the other? And if it does the person who made that contribution, if you want to call it that, his name have to be associated with the expense?
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what was the purpose of the expense? Was it for the benefit of the chapter as a whole, or was it for the benefit of that individual? Number one, if it's clearly for the benefit of the chapter, then it could be classified as a donation in kind.
Okay.
Okay.
It would have been for a chapter issue.
Right. And so basically they still need to report that to the treasurer. Okay, and one of the things that I think I will share with you is that the Dixie District does this, and we have a few of our officers who have, while I've been treasurer, have donated money that they've spent for hospitality provided at district events and all of that as donations in kind. So they have given me an expense report for that with the receipts attached so that I have documentation for what they spent and what purpose it was used for. But then they have basically, there's a box on the form that says, I am providing this as a donation in kind. And then they sign that. And then basically, depending on, then yes, that would be considered income to the chapter. So it's basically, it was money paid on the chapter's behalf by an individual who basically donated it for the use of the chapter.
Okay, thank you.
But yes, it's an important thing. I know there are a lot of things, a lot of money gets spent by individual members to support the hobby. Most of those expenses are their own and are just purely hobby expenses. But if they really are spending their own money for things that are to the benefit of the chapter, then yes, they should be reporting that, and they should be getting acknowledgement of those as donations as well. In particular, if those donations are more than $250 in value, you are specifically obliged to give that person written acknowledgement of that gift.
Okay,
Okay. Although it's good practice if anybody makes a donation to give them a written acknowledgement, just because even just to say thank you is a good thing to do, because it means that you're
Okay.
acknowledging what they've done for your benefit.
okay.
Okay. We're about 5 minutes from a break. Any other questions?
10 minutes. She just threw up on the screen 10 minutes away.
Oh, did she? Okay.
Yeah. Just one other thing on your donations in kind, and yeah, we have the same thing in the Carolinas district. And it's not a huge issue with chapters, but I am aware there have been occasions when that issue came up and it was right at the cusp of pushing them into another level from an IRS standpoint on a 990 filing. And so they questioned that. But also, years ago, it was made clear that if you were ever looking to get grants, that the bigger you are, the better chance you are of having somebody paying attention to you. And so there are chapters that would go to a large to try to do the most to get their revenues up and their expenses up, maybe a wash, but to make themselves look bigger in the eyes of a granting organization. Because if you're a $10,000 chapter versus a $50,000 chapter, you know, which one are they going to want to give money to?
Yeah.
So that's just
that is an important point. It can play a psychological part in your evaluation by granting organizations. I think one of the things that I've heard talked about both at the society and at the district level is that one of the things that actually is an even bigger indicator is that how much of your own membership is donating to you to support your chapter, because most organizations, granting organizations, are going to want to see that your members have their own skin in the game, that supporting those outreach efforts is as important to them as you want it to be to that granting organization. So that's another big participation. And this is one place where participation counts, and being able to acknowledge that on the part of particularly members and your friends in your audience is a big deal from a granting organization perspective. If you can say that 40% of my members are regularly donating to my chapter, 40% of my ongoing or my event audience is also making contributions, whether they're small dollar or big dollar, doesn't matter. If you can get high participation rates, that's going to make a big difference with granting organizations. That's a good point, Ted. So just from a broad standpoint, because of the size of most chapters that we're dealing with, we're going to be dealing with income and expense on a cash basis. And that basically means that income is recognized when you get it in the form of cash, or when you can actually make use of it in the form of cash, and expenses are recognized when you actually put money out the door. The alternative to that is called the accrual method, which is something that most larger businesses use. And it basically means that income is recognized when you have the right to receive it, as opposed to when you actually receive it. And expenses are recognized when you actually have used goods or services purchased from another person, even if you haven't paid for them. So, for example, if you rent a venue for a chapter show and that venue does not require you to pay them up front, but will invoice you after the event is held, technically, once you've actually had the show, you owe them money because you have already used their services, even if it takes another month for them to send you an invoice. Under cash accounting, you would only recognize that expense when you actually pay them the money. And that's really the key difference. I think it's for most chapters, it makes the most sense because of the amounts of money we're dealing with to basically be accounting for things on a cash basis. I don't think there's a lot to be gained by trying to do the work of using accrual method accounting for most chapters, or even for the district for that matter. So let's see, the fiscal year, I think is obviously the society and the chapter both. We use the calendar year as the fiscal year. Unless you're a new chapter and you start up mid-year, then you have an initial short year. That's something that Middle Tennessee has dealt with not very long ago in its first year of startup. And then I think the other thing that I think I can't stress enough is that make sure that you are getting proper documentation from your officers and other people who are engaging with vendors on your behalf, that you've got clear documentation of who you spent the money with, what it was for, so that you can account for it correctly. Because one of the things I will say to you, and I think this is something that um, while a lot of people think about accountants as people whose jobs are primarily about keeping track of numbers, I'd say to you that more of an accountant's job is more about proper classification of a transaction than it is just about anything else. Accurate numbers are important, but they're secondary, because if you classify transactions improperly, you can paint a very misleading picture of what's going on in your chapter. So I think that's actually a far more important thing, and good documentation from your people will help you meet that goal. And Ted, as a fellow CPA, I don't know it's a philosophical point. I don't know how much you agree with that or not.
Very true. Very true.
So that's it. And, and make sure that when you're receiving money from people, I think this goes back to my comment about donations and acknowledgments. Anytime you get money from some source, make sure that you provide a receipt to them, because it's important for their bookkeeping as well. You want to serve the same benefit to them as you hope they will serve to you if you were on the other side of that. If you were going to get a receipt or an invoice for some money that you spent, you should be willing to extend that courtesy back to somebody from whom you receive money. Now, a lot of times there are things that are going to help do that for us. If you're selling tickets to a chapter show, if you're using something like PayPal or Eventbrite or Square, those tools are going to help provide receipts to your customers, which is a great thing. That helps take a little bit of that burden off of you. If you haven't been using one of those tools, I would highly encourage you to do that. I know both the district and the Music City chapters experience with Eventbrite has been very positive up to this point in time. We especially encourage it. One of our own members, Rick Spencer, works for Eventbrite, and he has been very, very helpful in helping us make the most of the benefits that you can get from those platforms. So I urge you to explore them if you want to. So let's see, we're 2 minutes out from break. see, what's next? Okay, financial reports. This is something that when we talk a little bit about using tools like Quicken and QuickBooks later on, those tools will provide a very basic income statement and balance sheet that you can present to your board meetings. One of the things that I have found as chapter treasurer and district treasurer, and actually to some extent even more as district treasurer, I think, is that a standard income statement where it groups all of the expense items in one block and all of the income items in another block is not necessarily going to be a format of reporting that helps your board members understand what's going on. So one of the things that I inherited from both a chapter level and a district level was a financial statement presentation ethos that really revolves around being able to show people how specific events contributed either net income or net expense to the chapter's operations. For example, the Music City chapter typically held 2 shows a year, one during the holidays and one at some point during the spring or summer. And so for those events, generally I would present a financial statement that was basically would show the expense for that event and the income for that event together and show the net results of that. So we're coming up about 50 seconds away from break. So I'll probably stop there and we'll pick that topic up when we come back from break. If you haven't been doing it, I strongly urge you, bio break and a glass of water and a little bit of something to munch on is certainly called for at this point in time because it's getting late in the afternoon and I want you all to stay bright-eyed and bushy-tailed while we're talking about this. I know this is not the most enthralling subject matter, even for people who like it like me. But I want you to stay engaged so that we can have a good session. And I look forward to more of your questions and discussions as we go forward in the afternoon. And with that, I will let you head to break. Thank you all. See you in 10 minutes.
The next session is going to start at 2:40 and Eastern time, 1:40 Central time, 2:40 Eastern time, and it's going to automatically put you into your rooms at 2:40 at that time.
Okay. Melinda, I sent you an email about 20, 30 minutes ago, but I guess you didn't get it. We were wondering about whether we should, if he was supposed to pause the video or stop the video recording.
Send me a text or sorry.
Email.
I tried to do a broadcast message with my phone number. I don't know if everybody saw it. Some people did. Did he pause or did he stop? Was that Charlie?
Yes, I think he paused.
He paused it.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you have the option to hit pause, awesome. Not everybody has the option to hit pause, depending on if you're on the website or if you don't have the most recent version of.
We're back.
Okay. There he is. Okay. I was about to say I was going to wait until Tom was able to rejoin us. We're okay. Okay. So we left off talking about financial reporting to your board. And basically, my opinion is that, as in order to make sure that your board is making informed decisions, it's important for you not only to tell them what, but to some extent to be able to help them understand the why. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, from my point of view, and I to extent will say that I was standing a little bit on the shoulders of the people who came before me, and that they had already developed this approach to reporting to the boards that was more circled around being able to provide an idea of how particular activities contributed to the financial operations of the chapter as a way. And I did not see there was no good reason to not continue doing it, because I think it did make for a more informed board. because otherwise that means that you're putting your board members in a position of having to do that work for themselves, of having to say, well, if we put on a holiday show and it cost us $10,000 to put on and we only made $8,000 in ticket sales, well, then that wasn't necessarily a positive event for us. So I think that's as the person responsible for financial reporting, it's part of our role to help people, to get them to the point where they can start having better discussions around, okay, how do we do that better, instead of having to have the conversation about, well, what does that mean about how much we lost or how much we made? So I think it actually helps get your board to a position where it can make better informed decisions faster, and to be able to talk about how to improve instead of just talking about what do the numbers mean. I think if you start from the position where your job is helping people understand what the numbers mean, then you can actually help them get to those more important discussions sooner. Some of you have already done this. I'm interested to hear your perspectives. How do you present your financial reports to your boards now, that to those of you that have been doing it?
Well, our monthly reports, financial reports, basically are what you say, George. I kind of categorize all of the income, but break it down into the types of income that we had, and then I itemize the expenses so that you can look very quickly. Well, and then towards the bottom of that, I summarize some of those things, like show revenue and expenses, so that we can clearly do that. I do it on a monthly basis, and the spreadsheet that I present to the board kind of shows the budget for the year, well, what we spent last year, the budget for the year, and then month by month what we have been either earning or spending in each of those categories with a total for the year, so that everybody can kind of see what the patterns are looking like. Mm-hmm. We don't have anything that are big numbers in our chapter. I mean, so it's pretty simple to do, but that's just kind of a one sheet or sheet and a half summary of where we are, but with the ability to understand where things came from.
And I think David has brought up another good point to discuss, which is the concept of a comparative financial statement, as they say in the trade. So basically, if you're showing not just your results relative to your budget, but also your results relative to one or more previous years, I think that does help to provide important context for the board's decision makers in terms of progression over time, as well as your performance relative to what your plan was when you started a given year. And I think that's important. I think for most barbershop chapters, presenting a single comparative year is probably sufficient. If I imagine some of the larger chapters might want to show 2 years or perhaps 3, depending on what their planning cycles are like, because that's also an important thing to take into account. I am sure that larger chapters are probably have perhaps 2 or 3 year planning cycles, or maybe even 5, as opposed to most chapters that are probably planning on maybe a 1 to 2 year cycle. Is that a beer you're drinking, Patrick? Because that would be awfully cool.
It's coffee.
It looked like a Stein.
No, it's just coffee.
Just coffee.
It's a big mug.
Okay.
Pittsburgh 2015 International mug. I think this was a defective product that I got when I was interning at BHS back 5 years ago.
Yes, factory seconds. Sources of swag everywhere. Okay, so I think we talked about that. Chapter statements from the society. Again, we've talked a little bit briefly about that. To the extent that you receive an invoice from the society for something specific, and I think for most chapters, that's going to relate to your insurance invoice every year. That's going to be the most common thing that you're going to be asked to pay the society for directly. I think from a district standpoint, Ted, I think you'll, depending on how they continue to go forward with the cost sharing um, concept for judges certification. I don't know how many judges there are that are members of the Carolinas district. I think part of that, that's the other thing that you may actually end up eventually having to deal with from a district standpoint.
True.
Um, it's a very big deal for the Dixie district because on a per capita basis, we are overweighted with judges by a fair piece, and Patrick is one of them. It's
You're welcome.
it's one of the things that makes Dixie a particularly dynamic district musically, especially as having so many people who are part of that program. And that's easy, but paying a bill on time shouldn't be a challenge. If it is, I think your chapter has bigger issues to deal with. Either you as a treasurer or your chapter as a whole needs to talk about this. So the society's presentation on this then delves into how to set up a chart of accounts. Now, here's the thing. Most of us are not dealing with new startup chapters where we're creating an accounting structure out of whole cloth. And we've got to basically build it up from the ground up. I, as both a district and a chapter treasurer, inherited an established chart of accounts. By all means, if you inherited one, continue to use it. Don't be afraid to tweak it if you feel that something needs to change in order to better express the reality of what your chapter is experiencing. I think that's part of you being a key decision maker for your chapter. If you start doing a different kind of community outreach event or a different kind of performance event, and you want to make sure that you're tracking that clearly, then add relevant accounts to your chart to track the income and expense for that event. That's simply being prudent and smart about the way you go about fulfilling your role. I think some of the things that we talked through, I think that the key things that you need to talk about are basically that you've got to make sure that any money that is specifically coming in that's specifically supposed to support chapter operations, like paying rent for rehearsal venues, paying rent for performance venues, helping you to pay for music and learning media. I think those are things that have to be kept in and used from very, very specific sets of accounts. Then there's also things that are called pass-through or social. And those are basically things that if you're doing events for the sake of hospitality, both within the chapter for your guests at events, those are things that need to be sort of thought of as separate and apart from that. I think the other things, if you're doing any kind of this pay-as-you-sing concept is one that I think is probably out of favor and out of practice in most chapters nowadays. I don't know that anybody's doing it. There may be some things related to membership drives that bring in people to learn how to sing some specific holiday songs and perform with you on a chapter holiday show as a way of perhaps promoting membership as a singing organization that are probably actually membership expenditures, membership development expenditures as well, and not really pay as you sing. So I think basically this numbering scheme that you see here, where you see income accounts are 300s, expense accounts are 400s.
Yeah,
Again,
George, you're not sharing anything with
I'm
us.
not sure. Oh, did that stop? I apologize. I didn't realize that when they broke out the session. My apologies. I neglected to bring that back up. My bad. Thank you, Ted. Okay. All right. So this is sort of the basic outline of a chart of accounts as the society sees it. And, it's funny where they see the cash accounts as 100 operations, cash accounts for dues and social pass-through. I think that will be something that you determine on your own. Like I said, most of you have probably inherited an accounting structure already. Um, I don't see that there's anything to be gained by wholly upending it. I think you can stick with what you've got and tweak it as you need to. Um, I can say for a fact that I know that both the Music City chapters chart of accounts that I inherited and the Dixie chart of accounts that I inherited only follow this plan to the extent that the cash accounts are 100. Okay. The income accounts, let me think about this. We have cash accounts are 100, fixed asset accounts are 200s. So all of ours, so the cost for the risers that the district purchased 2 years ago are in accounts that have 200 numbers. Okay, and that's pretty much it for assets. Our liabilities are 300s. Our liability and our equity accounts are 300s. And then our income and expense accounts are 4, 5, 6, 700, depending on the nature. So the shows, district conventions are 500s. Leadership Academy like this is 600, and Harmony Explosion Camp is 700. No, I take that back. Harmony Explosion Camp and Leadership Academy are 600s, and Harmony Explosion Camp is 700. And then we also had accounts for the district marketplace, which were different. So that's, so that's basically the way that what I inherited. And as a general rule, I didn't see any major reason to monkey with it over much, because it worked and it supported the reporting objectives that I was trying to follow. So I didn't do that. I have occasionally stopped using certain accounts because they are no longer relevant to what's going on. And I've added a couple of sub accounts to things over time. One of the things that I do is that I use QuickBooks for the district, and I used it for the chapter. So basically it allows you to have both main accounts and sub accounts as well. So I make use of that feature liberally. Working in a corporate accounting environment makes that sort of not a very difficult concept for me to deal with, because it's something that I've lived with in my professional life for 30 years now. So I don't really have a big problem with that. So I think you should do what seems to work best for your chapter. If your chapter board is comfortable with the classification scheme in your chart of accounts as it works right now, then by all means stick with it. If you seem to be getting questions from your chapter officers about things on a regular basis because they feel like they need more detail, then I think that's a perfect opportunity to explore the possibility that you may need to think about your chart of accounts a little bit differently and maybe add some accounts in particular areas to help address those questions more directly. I don't know that you will encounter that problem in your work with your chapter boards, but it's something you should certainly be open to. I think from the standpoint of dues, nowadays, chapters play no overt role in the processing of members' dues payments, other than perhaps in the initial registration of a new member and how you choose to handle that. What happens is that the society will pay the dues that are due to your chapter based on whatever your current rates are. And you can find those rates published. You can find those on the society website in the member center for your chapter. Those are available. If you're not sure what they are, that's obviously something that your VP of membership and your secretary will probably be very, very well aware of, since they're the people who will play the primary role in registering new members. I think that it's basically, they include this for a reason that's a little bit mystifying to me. I have never had a member ask me if I would pay their dues for them. I don't know if anybody's had that thing. I think chapters, if they wish, if they need to help support members that are struggling financially, There's a way to set up funds for that that are dedicated to that purpose, to have members contribute to them. So I think if you find yourself in a place where you're getting those kinds of requests, I think you should explore with your board setting up that kind of a fund. I know that Music City Chorus does it for things like helping members who might struggle to attend events like chapter performance retreats, or to attend district or international conventions when we go. So I think that's something that you should certainly be aware of, but I don't think that we have any direct role to play in the payment of members' chapter dues, other than initial registration. So here we come with the hard and fast, the regulatory stuff, the stuff that's important and is necessary to get done in a timely way. So let's talk about, we've talked already about chapter incorporation. And again, I think the regulations for this will differ from state to state. I think part of you and your chapter president and your secretary just need to be educated and aware of this and make sure that someone has specific responsibility for keeping it up. And that as chapter board members change over time, that topic gets refreshed. I think that's important to do. The IRS tax return, whether you form the 990 easy or the 990N, I don't think matters specifically. You only need to know that in normal years, the deadline for filing this is May 15th of every year. That deadline was extended this year. But I don't expect that to happen again anytime in living memory. I would be surprised if it happens again this year. But just be aware, May 15th is the date. I think if you want to save yourself a little bit of time and trouble, if you are familiar with how to use Excel, I think it would behoove you, and this is something that I did when I started as district treasurer in particular, basically is to set up an Excel spreadsheet that basically takes your chart of accounts and basically outlines it with what line on the 990 form information from that particular account has to go in the form. And then basically that's something that you can reuse year in and year out as you have to file new tax returns. I found it shortened the first time I did it, it took me a little bit of time, but every time thereafter. And if anybody had a question, or if I ever thought I might face a question as to why something was on a particular line of the form, I had an already built work paper that I could show to support. Here's where it sits in my chart of accounts. This is the type of account it is. And that's why I put it on that line in the form. So, I can show you the example that I built for the Dixie district. I can share that with you if anyone is interested. It certainly does streamline the work a little bit, because preparing a tax return, as I'm sure if any of you owns a small business or files a Schedule C, then basically you would probably have some experience with how tedious and sometimes time consuming completing a tax return can be. So I think anything that you can do to give yourself resources that will help make that job a little bit easier for you year in and year out, I urge you to do it. That's the technique that I chose to use. You can use whatever you do, but I do recommend that you're thinking about it and trying to build something that's reproducible from year to year that you can basically use. If anybody wants that, just send me a note in the chat and I will make a note of it and send it to you when we're done. I will be providing it to Bob Peters as my successor, so that he's already got that work paper filled in for this year's tax return, since he will be the one filing it. And then lastly, the society asks us to do a financial review every year. Now, having done this, the form that's there, basically what it demonstrates is really that you are keeping up to date on your bank account reconciliations. That's primarily what it represents. And that's an important part of being a reasonably good steward of your chapter's resources. Doing those bank reconciliations every month is first and foremost part of your responsibility. So getting that done, the problem is often comes down to finding somebody who is willing to do it. And this is and this is probably the big challenge that most of you will find yourselves facing as chapter treasurers. If there is a person who is willing to do it from within your chapter that is not also a member of your board, that would be great. Feel free to reach out to people outside your organization if you have people that are comfortable doing it. They do not have to be accounting professionals. They do have to be people who are not afraid of signing their name on something that says, yes, I checked this. It does actually represent what they said it does. And really what you're going to turn over to them to support that are basically your own bank reconciliations for that purpose. And they're going to fill out a form that basically says, hey, the beginning amount of cash in this account was this, the ending amount was that, the net result of income and expense items was that. It really is what in the accounting trade is known as a roll forward schedule. And so it's not that complicated, but a lot of people will, when they hear that you're asking you to do a kind of financial review, they hear audit, and that's not what you're asking them to do. So it's something that's very, you need to stress that. You're really just asking them to do what's the equivalent of a year-long bank reconciliation. That's really what you're asking them to do, but you've got all the records. They're not being asked to do any of that themselves. I mean, that's probably the hardest part, is going to be finding somebody who is willing to do it. And then basically, once your tax return and your financial review are done, you scan them and basically upload them to the society website to indicate that you've done it. The society asks that your financial review be done by June 30th of every year. There's no penalty or public shame or ridicule that they will hold you up to if you don't do it by June 30th, but it's good practice to do it. The other thing that I would say is that, so when we talk about which type of 990 you need to file, again, I think it comes down to these classifications. They're not hard. They haven't changed in recent years. So I think it's just something that a lot of chapters will probably be able to file the 990N. Some chapters will have to file the 990EZ. The 990EZ can be a little bit daunting when you first look at it, but I think if you use the returns that your predecessors have filed as a guide, you will find that it's not really as daunting as it looks, because those should be available to you. If they don't happen to have copies on the society website, they should be available on the IRS website, because these are public records and they are available to the public, I believe, for 3 years from the date that they're filed, or for the year for which they're filed. So you should be able to go back on the IRS website and find your chapter's 990 for the last several years, if you don't already have it available to you, either from your predecessor's records or from the society website itself. Any questions about that? Okay. The chapter financial review, as I said, this is something that basically it simply demonstrates to the society that you're being a good steward of the chapter's resources, and that you are performing what are considered your normal and regular duties, like doing regular bank statement reconciliations on an ongoing basis. It just is a way of demonstrating that you are doing it, and that a third party who has no direct stake in that process is basically willing to affirm that, yeah, he's doing what he says he's doing. His records are up to date and accurate based on the documentation that has been shared with me. like I said, your biggest challenge will be able to find a willing person to help you with that task. Um, so that's that. Okay. Here's the thing about storing records. So there's always a lot of discussion about how long should I keep things. So for a lot of years, depending on the nature of what you're doing, most people said, typically you should keep things for roughly 7 years, and then it's okay to discard them. With electronic storage, the need for being able to store things for a longer term is certainly easier than it once was. That doesn't mean that you should, because frankly, at a certain point, keeping all those records ends up becoming counterproductive to a certain extent, unless you have a real deep need in your chapter or somebody has specifically asked for a very long-term retrospective of what's going on. Which, if you were going to keep anything, I'd say for a very, very long run, I would say keep your end of year financial statements, keep your tax returns, keep your financial review documents, but anything that relates to specific receipts or invoices for money that you spent, if you keep it more than 7 years, you're probably hanging on to it too long. Just because the likelihood of somebody asking you to go back and answer a specific question going back further than that, they're probably being unrealistic or irrational, and you should be willing to say that to them. Because it's like somebody brings up something from 10 years ago and you say, do you really expect me to have records for that after this much time? It really doesn't make any sense that that would still be relevant today. Because in many cases, usually after 3 or 4 years, information stops being relevant. But there's no real regulatory requirement for you to keep things more than a few years. So I think it's just a matter of what you and your board are comfortable with, and take that approach. If you're in a position where you can reduce records to some kind of digital form, like a PDF, and store it electronically, by all means do. It makes it easier to pass along to people who will come after you. I would do that. If you're not in a position to be able to do that easily, I would say, if you're interested in that, reach out to the members of your chapter and see if there's somebody who can help you with that, who has the resources already. Because of the nature of the work that I do, because of the nature of the work that my wife does, I have had a digital printer, scanner, copier probably in my home in some way, shape, or form for the last 15 years. Okay, so I already have the resources to do that, and I do reduce a lot of things to electronic form. That doesn't mean I don't keep the paper. I do. But that just means that I also have certain very critical things in digital form as well. And those I do pass on. Go ahead.
Let me ask a question. I think you're suggesting it's not necessary to keep paper past 7 years or so. If you have it in electronic form, I mean, should you keep it? Should you not keep it? What's your thought on electronic documents more than 7 years old?
So I think it's the difference between whether you're keeping everything. So if you keep every receipt, every invoice, every copy of every check you ever deposited in the bank, if you happen to use a checkbook that has a stub that you keep in a book somewhere, I would say you don't need to reduce that to digital form necessarily. I think that's okay. You can keep that in paper form, and after a certain number of years, you can discard it. I think you need to keep key documentation in electronic form. I think your bank statement reconciliation should be kept. Okay, I think that's a key document. I think your tax returns, as I said, should be kept. That's a key document. For society purposes, your financial review documentation is a key document. You should keep that. I don't think that the rest of the truly detailed documentation needs to be kept, and doesn't necessarily need to be reduced to electronic form either. I think that's overkill.
Well, but part of my question is, if I
Sure.
have electronic documents that are more than 7 years old, are they worth keeping, or should I just clear that file space?
You can clear that file space. I don't think that you run any significant risk of doing that. And because frankly, if somebody asks you, well, they were old records, I discarded them.
Okay, thanks.
I am not a believer in keeping things forever. Um, that's one of the reasons why we have recycling centers these days. So all that paper, put it in the recycling bin. I am fortunate in the Nashville area that I have recycling provided as part of my government services for the property taxes I pay, and I take copious advantage of it.
That's
Not just for
great.
personal stuff, but for other stuff as well. So like I said, I think that's something that you and your board have to decide on. I think it's not a decision you should make solely on your own. I think it's something that you had to make sure that your board is comfortable with as well.
Right,
And how long
right,
you're
for
going to
sure.
keep things and in what forms. And this point about preparing for a natural disaster, I think is important because stuff happens. If you live in a place where you have a true basement and you're in a place that might get flooding, I would consider moving those records to a place that wouldn't be subject to water damage. But that's just being prudent. Um, if you keep a lot of things electronically, as David said, if you've already done that, make sure that you've got a backup someplace else. I back up my stuff both on a local separate hard drive as well as in a cloud storage space as well. So that way I am not basically, if something happens to my home, I can still get access to those records. Okay. If something happens to my main laptop and the separate hard drive is still good, I can get a new laptop and I'm back in business within a couple of minutes. Okay. So it's just worthwhile being prudent with your information. Okay. But that will have to be tailored to your individual situation, both from your home and what your chapter wants. In some cases, like, most chapters, because we're not necessarily in spaces that we use exclusively or all the time, oftentimes we don't have on-site storage for most things. So that's something that, it means chapter members may be storing particular things like your music library or your risers or other equipment that you use on a regular basis. They may actually be individual chapter members storing them personally. I think this applies as much to the things that they hold on behalf of the chapter, as well as it does to the records that you're keeping on behalf of the chapter for financial purposes. In some cases, that means, safeguarding the chapter's assets too. So I think because that is part of what you're responsible for, I think you need to make sure that you're having those conversations with your chapter board members on a regular basis to make sure that all those things are being done in a way that actually does preserve their value and make sure that in the event of an unfortunate event, you still have access to them. I think that's just being smart about the way you go about doing what you do that. But I think most of us probably at this point are doing some form of that in our personal lives. It's just looking to extend that to our quote on this this part of our life as well. And again, this is all about making sure that you've got, are you prepared for a visit from your federal government? I do not know if any barbershop chapter has ever actually been audited. I've never, if it's ever happened, the society's never talked about it. I don't know the society's ever been audited for that matter. It's possible, I don't know. But I think this is just a matter of being prudent. Make sure that that you've got records for everything that you do, that you're keeping them in an organized way, and that If anybody calls for them, whether it's the government or anybody else in your chapter who has a right to see them, that you can get to them quickly and without too much muss and fuss. As I said, I think that's just being prudent, and not necessarily being hyper vigilant. Let's see, IRS regulations. So, let's see, I want to go back one. Click that too soon. So I think we've talked about this. Every chapter should have its own employer identification number. Hello, Andy. You're on mute. Still?
What happened?
There you go. I don't know. You seem to have jumped into our group unexpectedly. This is the treasurer's group.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. If you in the lower right corner of your screen, there should be a leave button.
Okay.
You click that and go back and get Melinda to put you back where you ought to be, I think.
That's really weird. Okay, appreciate it. Sorry, man.
No
You do
problem.
special things, Andy.
Oh, hey, you know what? I outsmart myself all the time. Thanks.
That was fun. So I guess point about this is that you obviously you should probably know it. And Melinda jumping in for something. Maybe not. Maybe she's just maybe she was chasing Andy. Oh, they're both back. You're still on mute, Andy. Or you're on mute again, rather, I should say.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm back. I bumped out and then I joined the chapter development, and here I am.
Yeah. And Melinda's here too.
Hey, Melinda, can you put me back to the chapter development room, please? Hello?
May have to send a chat message to Melinda.
Yeah.
All right. Chat. Okay. Sorry to interrupt, guys. Go ahead, carry on. I'm on my way out.
Okay.
I mean that figuratively, not. Yeah, right.
There's room show when needed. Okay. Let's see. I think let's see. So we're talking about employer identification numbers. If your chapter should have one of its own, because you are a separate organization, and you as treasurer should know what that is, for sure. I think it will be used most often on your annual tax returns, and it'll get used on any 1099s that you issue. I think you probably understand this inherently, but just to make sure that you understand it clearly, that none of the income that flows through the chapter is for the benefit of any individual member. It is solely for the benefit of the chapter as a whole. And we are also barred from participating from a chapter standpoint, okay, in any form of political activity. That means advocacy of any way, shape, or form, okay? You can participate in civic events without it being an issue. But you can't actually advocate on behalf of a specific candidate or issue that is basically being voted on by the electorate as a matter of course. And you also have and that goes along with saying that the chapter cannot speak specifically to things like legislation for itself. Individual members can say whatever they want so long as they say it outside of the context of the chapter. Again, that's simple prudence. I don't think that needs to be overweighted. Most people should understand that implicitly. I have not had any experience of that being a problem in a chapter or district that I've been involved with so far. Admittedly, I've only been doing this for 13 years. So, you know, compared to some people, my experience is a bit thin still, but that's okay. The one thing I would say, the next thing that is filing 1099. So this is probably the one that that engenders the most anxiety in people, but is also probably the simplest one to understand. And I think for most of us, chapter directors are probably the most likely person that we are going to have to submit a 1099 form. Now, the 1099 is basically a form that any business uses to report money it paid as compensation for services provided to an individual that is not a member of the organization, or that may be a member of the organization but is fulfilling a specific role. For most of us, that's going to be our chapter directors. If you pay them more than $600 in a calendar year, then you must file a 1099. You must give them a 1099, and you must also file that with the IRS because they have a program that they call matching. Now, one thing that doesn't show up here is that something important changed for the calendar year of 2020. So it used to be that there was a form called a 1099 MISC, in which this type of personal non-employee compensation was reported. Beginning with calendar year 2020, the IRS has now decided that specifically non-employee compensation, what was usually classified as miscellaneous 7 type income, now needs to be reported to the recipient and to the IRS on a different form called a 1099 NEC. So that was an interesting twist, and again, I know this because it's come up in my professional life as something that we're adapting to right now. But I think the general rules still apply.
What
If
was
you
that called again?
go ahead, so
What was
the form is called 1099 NEC.
NEC. Thank you.
NEC is the new form. One of the things that I have used in the past is that I have used a service called 1099.com to do my 1099s. It is very simple. It is very straightforward. It will not only allow you to produce the form that you need to send to your recipients, it would also submit it to the IRS as well. It's a great service. It's inexpensive. From that standpoint, I recommend it for just about any small business. If you are already a small business person that does this through a program like QuickBooks, then I would say that you can continue to use that. But 1099.com was actually a very useful and helpful thing to use for this purpose. Again, the example that they give here is about a quartet that you basically provide. These a quartet as an example. And so basically it's the $600 limitation is the thing. You paid the quartet as a whole, even if you split the money between the members, they received it. So you should still report that. Ideally for quartets, they usually have a contact person, and generally money is going to be funneled through that person, and it's their responsibility to divvy it up between them. If a quartet that you engage for a chapter show doesn't work that way, I think it would still be in your best interest to file a 1099 for them if the total amount you paid to the quartet was more than 600. Does anybody have any questions about that? Silence lends assent, so I'm going to move on. Tom, did you want to say something?
I agree.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. So this slide is intended to put the fear of God into you, basically. It's basically to tell you that, you know, the IRS does examine charitable organizations. It examines lots of taxpayers, lots of entities that file tax returns. In real world terms, the number of entities that get examined or audited in any given year is exceedingly small. So the risk is relatively light. If you are doing your job in a prudent way and you're keeping good records, you have nothing to fear from an examination. I think the top thing that it stresses here is that don't do something that your status as a tax exempt organization bars you from doing. If you can hold to that line and you comply with the other things you need to do, like filing 1099s on a timely basis, you have nothing to fear, even if you should get examined. But this is just a way of, you're always going to be better off under any circumstances if you're doing the right thing the right way. If you should happen to get examined, you really don't have anything to worry about. The IRS, go ahead.
Let me ask you about, I go back to the political activities thing. And this is not one that we've had any dealings with recently, but I understand during a period of time that I was away from the chapter. Our chapter was hired by one of the political parties to sing the national anthem at a rally, political rally. Now, we were hired to do it. They sang the national anthem, they left the stage, left the building. In the interpretation at that time was that that was not participation in a partisan political activity. That was performing at an event. Was that a safe assumption?
Yes, it was, because it was a paid engagement. Okay, it was a commercial transaction at arm's length. If the chapter had volunteered to go and do the event because it supported the candidate, that would be prohibited political activity. Okay, as a form of endorsing. But it was a paid and commercial transaction at arm's length. That's perfectly permissible.
That's what we thought, and I just wanted to confirm it.
Again, I've touched on this briefly. Again, once you've filed your tax return for any given year, it's available for 3 years after the year of filing. And so basically, you know, you must be available. It's just, you know, it's, again, if you've kept a copy of it, you should have it available and be able to provide it. I think one of the things that you need to make sure that you're doing, and I think, and I had a problem with this with the district this year for some reason, the name that you use on your tax return has to be the one that's on file for your chapter with the IRS. As apparently they don't use your employee, they don't use your EIN to match your records. They actually use your entity name. Don't ask me why they bother giving you a number if they're going to use your name. That's just government logic for you at its best. But I actually had a problem where I used the name that my predecessor had used, and the IRS came back this year when I filed the return for 2019 and said, hey, you didn't file your return. It's like, what do you mean? I have a receipt right here because I sent it certified mail. And they said, no, we still didn't get it. And it turns out that basically for some reason now they had decided that the name my predecessor had used was no longer the right one to use, and now had to be the one that they have on record. So that's something that, and you can check that. There's a specific information request you can make of the IRS to confirm that, of what your formal name is that they have on file, and basically make sure that you're using that in addition to the right employer identification number. It was kind of a surprise to me because I had filed the previous year's return using the name that my predecessor used and not had a problem. But for some reason, 2019, they deemed it an issue. So I changed the name. on the return that I had saved, reprinted it, remailed it to them, and everything was cool. It was kind of like it was one of those moments that it was like, what do you mean this didn't happen? You know, it's I'm a normal human being like everybody else. You get a letter from the IRS and says you didn't do the right thing. You kind of have a heart-stopping moment for a second. And go, "Ah, crap." And it happened to me, but it was not a big problem having to fix it. Okay, we've got 8 minutes. So let's start real quick. I have touched on this before, but I want to talk about a little bit and maybe hear from your perspective a little bit to those of you that have already had to deal with this. A budget is basically, it's your best estimate of what's going to happen with regard to the things your chapter plans to do in a given year, and expressed in the form of numbers, and specifically dollars and cents. It's not meant to be perfect. Any budget that is perfect is probably a lie, because the real world is never really that kind to anybody. And you can say, why do I need a budget? Well, you need a budget because basically at some level there needs to be a plan. Now, most of these plans don't have anything directly to do with you as treasurer. You're talking about, what is my membership vice president going to do this year to help bring in new members? What is my vice president of music and performance going to do with regard to shows? And likewise. So those are the plans that we're talking about. And it's really getting those people to sort of put something down in writing to say, I want to do this, and then be able to work with them to say, okay, well, about how much do you think it'll cost? This is kind of hard for people who don't have to do it on a regular basis as part of their lives. And a lot of us don't, to be quite honest. Unless you work in some sort of finance or accounting organization in a company, you probably don't deal with budgeting very much, or unless you have your own business. But it's an important exercise. It doesn't have to be excruciatingly detailed, but it has to have some kind of idea of, here's what we're going to try and make happen. You are, while it may be that you're the person responsible for collecting this information and putting in a form that's understandable from a financial standpoint, you are not the sole person responsible for it. I think really the primary responsibility for this falls with your president organizing a committee to do this and appointing a chair of that committee, which doesn't necessarily have to be you. It can be you, but it doesn't have to be you. But I think it's something that your boards have to be have to be engaged in. And this is a struggle for a lot of chapters. I know it's in certain years, it's been a struggle for Music City. I hope that's changed for the better. But it's something that some chapters will struggle to do, because it's simply not something that people are comfortable being able to say, well, here's what I want, and then being able to put a number on it. Certainly a problem. Well, we're about to close, so I will shut up there, and I will let you get ready for your next break, and we will pick this topic up when we resume in a couple of minutes. So thanks all, and talk to you again in a couple of minutes. Pause share and stop share.
We're back. George, you're muted, George.
Okay, we were talking about budgeting. So this is probably the one thing on which I kind of disagree with the society's position. I believe that the treasurer needs to be a part of the budget committee at all times. I do not necessarily agree that the treasurer needs to be the leader of the budget committee at all times. I think there are cases where, depending on the way that your board is structured, there might be a better person to lead. If you have an EVP or if you have a vice president of operations, it might be better for that person to lead the discussion instead. Um, but that's something that you can decide with your chapter president. I think the one thing that you need to be clear about is that at the end of the day, you're going to be the person who needs to reduce this information to some form of um, basically an income statement that basically says, based on what we plan to do, this is how much money we expect to earn. This is how much money we expect to spend. Here's whether we're going to make a loss or whether we're going to make a profit. Um, um, all things being considered, it's probably not a good idea to budget for a loss. You know, at best, you want to be budgeting to something like break even. Ideally, if you can, budget to a modest profit every year, and then see what you can do at making sure that your real world plans actually get you to that position. As I said, budgets are intended to represent what we believe we can reasonably make happen based on what we know today. It doesn't mean that you'll always hit that mark. It means that you may hit the mark or something close to it, and you may miss it in a negative way. You may miss it in a positive way. Just so long as you can explain why you missed it. And I think the idea is that you really need to be able to break it down at the level that makes sense for your chapter. I, specifically recommend dealing with things like membership development, um, show production, and other operational concerns. Like if you've got maintenance if you've got a trailer, for example, to haul risers, and that's got to be maintained periodically. You're going to need to replace tires. You're going to need to maybe, fix hinges on doors and things like that. Some of that stuff goes into that. You're also going to have um, other things that come up that you're going to be surprised by. But I think the key thing to remember is that at some point you've got to be able to get every officer who has an expectation of, I am either going to be trying to generate income for the chapter, or I'm going to be spending money for the chapter in order to accomplish certain things, that they've got to have some kind of a plan and an idea of what that's going to be, what that's going to mean financially. As I said, this is probably harder than anything else you'll do as a chapter treasurer, is getting people to have realistic discussions about this and being able to get it into a form that actually you can reduce to something that makes sense and get accepted as a board resolution. But it's an important thing to do, because if you don't have a plan, then what are you actually going to get done? Maybe you'll get things done if you don't have a plan, but you're more likely to get there if you do have a plan. And I think that's the more important point. I think you've got to think about all these things: dues, show revenue, ad sales, uniforms, sponsorships, grants, other things that you spend for hospitality items and all of that. I think you've got to be able to talk about it. And I think you've got to be able to talk about it in a relatively non-confrontational but very specific way. You've got to figure out how to help hold people's feet to the fire and be able to get them to get as specific as they can be. Because that's often the hardest part of this, is getting people to be specific. Well, I think we might do this. Well, so let's get into that. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think it's important for there to be other people as part of this process to do that. I think I think part of what addresses this is what is your chapter really devoted to from a day-to-day standpoint. Some chapters are really very much performance oriented. Some are very much community outreach oriented. I think your particular chapter's character and mission is what will determine what plays the biggest role in your budget and who should be engaged in that process. Um, Anybody have any success stories, let's call them that, or opportunities that you've had in your experience so far as treasurer, or things that you think that might be useful for others in this regard? Go ahead, Tom.
What I've found helpful is to be able to look back on the prior year and certainly bring forward to the new budget those items that are sort of basic costs. Could be the director's salary, um, uh, the expectation of dues income, things that are kind of the standard, the cost of our telephone, bring those, for the most part, expenses forward. Looking at certain officers, for example, chapter development, marketing. Hey guys, what do you expect? What would you like to do? And it's going to cost money that needs to be plugged into the budget. Kind of focusing on the projection of expense first, and then realize, okay, the question that we're all going to deal with, it's not just me pointing the finger, but how are we going to make that money? Now we have a chapter show, but very often I've seen in the past, the chapter show comes together without a lot of thought to financial aspects. Yeah, we want to sell tickets, but what's the venue going to cost us? Are we setting this up right? And that kind of pushes us to the point of not only planning how we're going to spend the money, but planning how we're going to make the money. Mm-hmm. We can count usually perhaps on past experience of donations, but helping to bring these figures to the forefront really of the whole board to be a point of collecting the information, not forcing the information. That's been my experience.
Yeah, very true. I mean, reference to past experience is always helpful and informative. It's not, it doesn't prove anything necessarily, but it can help you, especially on those bare bone things that are basic essentials like director's compensation, rehearsal space rental, and all of that, which will hopefully for your chapter be relatively consistent things year over year.
Yeah.
That sets a good baseline. And then I think, so this is something that changing budgets while the year is in progress is something that, some organizations do. I don't necessarily, unless you suffer some really, really major change, and I'll take this past year as a case in point, where so many of us had to, obviously, we may have planned a couple of chapter shows and that got thrown out the window. And we had to do that. Obviously, a lot of things that chapters planned this year just passed never came to fruition. That's nobody could have expected that when the year started. But it's less a matter of, do you need to sit down and actually change your budget? Unless there was some very specific thing that you were kind of obliged to do, that you needed certain resources to accomplish, and now the circumstance was going to prevent you from meeting that obligation or put you at risk of not meeting that obligation, then you might have a reason to actually physically sit down and say, okay, we're going to have to rewrite this budget from the ground up because of this change in circumstance. Like I said, budgets are estimates. They're not intended to be perfect. And I think if you're being, If your board is in regular communication and you're being open and transparent in your communications with your chapter membership as a whole, when things happen that you don't expect to happen, or when things don't happen the way that you thought they would, you should be able to tell, your board should be able to understand that, and you should be able to have a relatively non-problematic conversation with your chapter membership about, well, we expected this to happen, circumstances changed, we didn't meet that goal, here's what we think why, here are the things that we're going to have to adjust in the going on. It's part of a community, it's partly a communication issue, um, as well as, do you necessarily need to rewrite your budget? I'm not a fan of that unless you really are talking about something significant and drastic. I don't know if anybody has any other opinions that they'd like to share. Go on, chapter insurance. Okay. All right. Here's some basic stuff. So the insurance that you get from the society basically is general liability insurance. Okay, and I'm sure most of us have some form of personal insurance, especially if you're a homeowner, particularly, you probably have some that covers the same kind of areas. I think it does, it's fairly economical, to tell you the truth, for most chapters. I think the price is not all that bad. It doesn't necessarily do a whole lot. I mean, how often you're going to have to file a claim is something that is obviously, the whole point of insurance is that it's going to be few and far between. If there were a lot of claims against these kinds of policies, the cost would probably be a lot higher than it is. The other things you need to know is that it's not something you can opt out of. And the other thing I think that you need to do is you also need to be willing to talk to the society about if you should happen to have additional particularly valuable assets, you may want to talk to them about, can I get additional coverage for these? If you have audio equipment that can be particularly difficult and costly to replace, or other things that may not be covered by that, I think you want to be able to have that conversation. I think one of the things that you will experience over time, and this is something that I think in particular for show chairs or perhaps in renting rehearsal spaces we'll deal with, is that venues that you work at or that you work with are going to want to they're going to want to see a certificate of insurance. And so it's while it's not necessarily, it's fairly quick and easy if you follow the recommended procedure that society gives you. There is information on the website about how to request an insurance certificate that you can provide to someone who asks for it. You can get it in relatively rapid order. I think the last time I had to work with the Music City chapter on this, I think it took about 3 days. So it isn't necessarily hard or difficult to do it, but you've got to be prepared with some relatively basic information to do it. And again, those are resources that are readily available on the society website in the document center that you can find with a very, very simple search. They do make a mention here of additional premiums for specific circumstances like youth workshops or festivals, groups that are not part of the society that might be performing on your shows. If you happen to be serving food or alcohol at an event, or if there's some other reason for additional insurance coverage, it can be secured at a price, but then again, that may take a little more time to arrange. Just be aware of that. Okay. Bonding. This goes back to the discussion that we had back at the beginning of your board designating people as having the ability to spend funds on the chapter's behalf. If you give somebody direct access to the bank account, whether it's by signature authority on checks or through electronic means by a debit card, and basically so long as you have basically included that in your board meeting minutes, who those people are, and you stick to that, you should be covered by this bond. All right, but you got to make sure that you dot those I's and cross those T's in order to secure that coverage.
George, is this the same resolution that you would want for naming people that are authorized on bank accounts?
Yes, it's exactly the same thing. This is basically dealing with the same thing, because basically what you're creating is the risk that those people will convert those funds for personal use. Okay. And so the bond is basically allows you to basically recover for any bad acts on the part of those people if they should make them. Now, obviously, you know, there's a whole bunch of other things that go along with that. Should you find yourself in the unfortunate circumstance where somebody that you've given responsibility for does that, you know, obviously you're gonna want to file an ethics complaint with the society on that person, because it's somebody who has shown themselves not to be a person who can act in good faith. You know, that's we don't want people who exhibit that behavior as part of the society. They represent a risk to all of us, and it's something that we should be willing to call out when it happens. Thankfully, it happens relatively rarely.
George,
Go ahead.
would deal with perhaps one of our members who's serving to run the box office at an event, selling tickets, taking in cash? Question mark.
I think it would be prudent to do that. I
Yeah.
think if you appoint them to that role specifically, and they are not under the direct supervision of you as the treasurer, then yes, I would say so. Again, I think that's prudence. Okay, fundraising. Um, this is again, this is can always be a big challenge for any chapter or any district in being able to mount events. Grant writing organizations are becoming ever more desirous of being able to demonstrate that they are having impact. And in particular, now the society is very, very interested in making sure that we're having impact, positive impact on communities that were not necessarily being served by our community as a whole. Um, and so that's something to be attentive to. Not necessarily that you should target every program that you try to create along those lines, but you should definitely review any program you try to create in such a way that it explicitly includes those underserved communities, whether they be based on economic status, whether they be on national or ethnic origin. I think you need to be very, very sensitive to that these days. The Society's Everyone in Harmony initiative is very much about making sure that we are being open and welcoming and inviting to everybody who is interested in being part of the singing community. And I think it's a worthwhile initiative to support. And um, I think you will, especially after the events of this year just passed, I think you'll see an ever increasing focus on that particular element of grant writing, especially for arts organizations, I think, because arts organizations do tend to be very heavily focused on upper income Caucasian audiences. And I think the ability to extend that audience is something that everyone in harmony was intended to accomplish. And I think that a lot of grant writing organizations, if your chapter does it, is something that you should be focused on. Again, the society has a lot of great resources to help you with that, and people specifically on the staff whose job it is to help you with that, not just for their grants, but to help you figure out how to get with grant writing organizations in your own communities. So that's something that you should work on if the opportunity provides it to you. I think you should also reach out to your chapters and to your broader networks to find out if there are other people who already have connections with those organizations and how you can help leverage what they know in order to, if you're not, if you've not been successful, to try and find ways to become successful, even on a small scale. Usually grants have a specific purpose. Make sure you read their requirements very specifically. Do everything that you can to address them directly. They don't like wishy-washy. Because Music City, we tried a couple of times for the Metro Davidson County Arts Commission and failed because they felt that we were not really addressing the specifics of what the grants were intended to do. So it's something grant writing organizations do pay attention to. And then I think here, talking about the Member Center, I've talked about the Document Center. There are a wealth of resources that relate to how to do this job well and how to deal with specific things as part of this job. I encourage you to make use of them. I've referred to them fairly frequently over the course of my tenure, and I think they do represent, there's lots of stuff there, not just for your role, but for other roles. I think at BHS, always go first and foremost to the customer service team. That's what their job is. If they are not the people who can help you find the answer to your particular question, they will know who within the organization is best positioned to do it. Oftentimes trying to call other contacts directly is not necessarily going to help you. So I think always go through customer service first and let them be your guides through the organization, because I think they will actually be able to help you get where you need to go faster than you're trying to sort of throw a dart at a dartboard. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about something that I mentioned earlier, having to do with electronic resources. So how many of you already have experience with programs like Microsoft Money, Quicken, or QuickBooks? 2, 3, 4. Okay. So basically, if you're new to this process, I would highly recommend using Quicken. It is relatively inexpensive. It is relatively easy to use. You may have experience with something like Microsoft Money or other online resources like, I can't recall, I think Mint is the other one. So there are lots of things that can help you do basic bookkeeping. One of the nice things about it is that they use a very checkbook-like interface, which is very easy for most people to understand. You put an amount of money either that you received or that you spent, and you'll have to place a category on it. One of the resources that I shared with you yesterday evening when I sent that out were sample templates for setting up a chapter in Quicken and QuickBooks both. And a lot of the what we saw before, that the Society's recommended chart of account structure, is already built into that. So I think those are great resources to use. If you really want to go old school, I would basically suggest that you go to a office product store, go on Amazon and get a basic accounting journal book, and basically find an online tutorial for how to do that. There is some material in the Document Center that basically addresses how to do this in paper form, if that's how you want to do it. I just don't recommend it, to be honest with you. I think it's far easier to use an electronic tool. How many of you already, those of you that don't already use Quicken or QuickBooks, I'm assuming because you're here, you have access to a computer, number one. I think the answer to that is yes. And then I think that you should be able to quickly get, and I think your chapter should probably help you, because it is something that you should be able to transfer to your successor when that comes along. Because I think it's a very easy way to keep records over a long run. It will help you with being able to produce reports. for your monthly reports for your board meetings. And so I think again, the hardest thing you'll deal with is basically getting your initial information set up and getting started. But that's a relatively simple thing. And again, I've done that for myself. I've done that for the chapter and for the district. So I'm more than happy to serve as a resource for that if you have questions when you try to do it. David, did you have a question?
George, the thing I mentioned for anybody that doesn't have Quicken or QuickBooks, there's an organization called TechSoup. I think it's TechSoup.com or TechSoup.org, where as a nonprofit organization like us, you can buy the software at a greatly reduced price and perhaps get it free. So don't be frightened by the cost of getting the software. Go to TechSoup.
Good point. Thank you, David. I'd forgotten about that. I think one of the problems was that I already had it when I assumed the role, so I didn't need to buy it again. But yeah, but if you don't have it, but go to TechSoup and buy that. As I said, I think Quicken is easier for people who are just starting up and have relatively direct needs. It's very simple. You don't get into all of the ins and outs of things like having to deal with inventory and fixed assets and all of that. But you can use only, if you choose to go with QuickBooks, you can use only as much or as little of it as you need. Because from a district standpoint, I've found that over the years that I've been doing it, I use various accounts. I have a relatively, substantial chart of accounts to deal with, but I basically have a couple of income statement reports, a couple of balance sheet reports, and a couple of journal reports if I need to dig into details on something. If I'm doing my quarterly financial statements for the district and I say that doesn't look right and I need to go dig into the detail, I've got a couple of saved reports that I basically can quickly reformat to look at well, heck, I classified that wrong. Let me change it and go back and rerun this report. So that's my recommendation to you. You're free to follow it or not, but I think you'll save yourself a lot of time and effort if you go down that road in the long run. The other thing that I mentioned is that both of those programs will give you very, very basic balance sheet and income statement reports to present to your board. In order to do a more something that's a little bit more directly addressing questions that are likely to come up in the context of a Barbershop Society chapter, you can offload those reports into Excel and rearrange them to a format that your board would prefer better. As I said, I inherited a particular reporting structure for the Dixie district that I have continued to maintain. Now that I've gotten accustomed to it, it's actually relatively easy to keep it up because all I have to do is just basically run the report, and basically I cut and paste rows to bring things into alignment. So it's actually relatively straightforward process for me now. The original setup was a little bit time consuming, but that's what it is. I heard somebody comment.
I will add, I use both Quicken and QuickBooks in different organizations, and I would strongly recommend Quicken. It is simpler, and a good Chevy or good Ford instead of a Maserati. Okay.
And less expensive.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I also happen to be using the online connection. So when I close out a session, it uploads and saves my data. I also save locally, but when we started this, it allowed two of us to access. If you need somebody, it's helpful to have somebody look in to see they have a login for themselves, and you can do that. So you're not just bound on one computer. Just something to think.
True that, and I agree. I think Quicken is an easier bridge to cross for most people. As a professional accountant, I actually don't particularly like QuickBooks. But then I've grown up accustomed to enterprise level accounting systems, and I don't think QuickBooks kind of subverts a lot of what I become accustomed to from a professional standpoint. I use Quicken as a personal from my personal finances, and I've done so for 30 years now. So I'm very comfortable with that interface. I think it will be easier for you to get accustomed to using it, and will actually help you serve your board and your chapter better. So Tom and Dave, thank you both for comments. I appreciate that. That's everything that I have. Does anybody have anything that they want to talk about? Well, there he is, the man
Let's
himself.
talk about Paul.
Let's talk about Paul. We just stopped talking about Paul.
I was going to say, you better have stopped.
Actually, it's funny, Paul, we were kind of just wrapping up at this point. I've actually finished all the material that I wanted to talk about. Just asking for questions from the floor, if you will.
Well, good, because I had 2 more classes to visit, and I think website's going to go a little longer because they got a bunch of nerds in that room. And
nerds always talk too much.
And I thought I would check in with you guys. I hope it's been a really good class. I hope that not only have you guys learned something, but I hope that George learned something too.
I always do.
Good, good. Did we talk about the new 1099s?
Yes, we talked about the 1099 NEC form.
Okay, great. I just wanted to be sure that got covered because I saw that email from Jim Sams, and I wanted to, I don't know if all the boards saw that, but I wanted to be sure that you guys knew about it.
And I was aware of it from my professional life already, so it's
makes sense. Makes sense. How about the rest of you guys? Pick something that you learned today and tell me about it.
I guess, Paul, one thing I would mention is clarification on record keeping and things of that nature, that questions that I've had, which were very helpful. This is the 3rd year in a row that I've been in George's sessions. Each year I have learned something from him. Each year it's been worthwhile and gets better. So I appreciate all of George's efforts with this.
Thank you very much. Thanks, David. Thank you. And we didn't charge you as much this year.
Well, that's true, but I didn't get lunch either.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
I learned the need for the importance for acknowledging donations and sending thank yous. I have neglected that a lot this year and didn't really realize that that was my responsibility. Even though it makes sense, I didn't realize that that was one thing that I needed to have been doing. So I've got to go back and actually do that to several people.
Cool. I see Ted was getting ready to say something, Ted?
Yeah, and this is a question, a district question. Does the district still have a show tax?
Yes, we do have a show assessment.
Assessment is the word we use. It is not a tax.
I don't know if that's new to any new treasurers. We have a chapter assessment in the Carolinas district.
Okay. Yes, because you don't care whether they make any money on the show or not.
That is true.
And George, let me follow up on that very point. When we're running the numbers for the show assessment, right? We're looking at revenue taken in for a show.
Correct.
And that would include advertising in the show program?
Yes.
Revenue, but not donations that might come in at any point of the year and coincidentally at showtime. How do we distinguish? Donation now, not advertisement?
So I think that goes to what I talked about before, is about the importance of classifying income and expense appropriately, okay, when you record it, okay, because basically show revenue should be recorded a certain way. I would never record donations as being relevant to a particular show. They're relevant to the chapter as a whole. So if you're counting revenues, if you classify that donation as a donation and not as show revenue, you would not be including it as part of what's being assessed.
Yeah, obviously in the past have been times when we've sold a whole page of the show program or a half page, quarter page, that sort of thing, different prices. But we've really evolved into a request for donations on a year-long campaign. We may acknowledge the names, but it's not an advertisement.
Right.
And
Acknowledging
again,
donors is a completely different thing. Absolutely.
I just want to make that point.
Mm-hmm.
Stealing money out of the district coffers, it's
It's not stealing.
no, it's not. I you see my smile?
Yeah,
Sending
but
a
you
lot,
smile like that all the time.
sending a lot of love to you, Paul.
I thank you so much. It means the world. But seriously, thank you guys for being here. This is one of the bigger classes in our Leadership Academy. And it's important to me that you guys care enough to come here and learn things and share things and spend some time together, because this is the volunteers that are our leadership teams are so very important. And I really do appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. So, and I've got to be out of here in about 3 minutes because I got one more class left to visit. And I think it's going to happen automatically, probably while I'm talking. But
Okay.
but just in case, like I say, thank you so much. Thank you. And I hope that you and your families all have a happy and healthy new year. Try to stay away from the COVID if you can. I got lucky, but I know I have lost friends, and I don't want to lose any more. And I want some time where we can all get back together and, by golly, sing a song. So,
Yeah.
all right, well, they haven't cut me off automatically, so I'm going to go. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank
See
you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul, for all you do.
Same to you.